morning. Welcome to the Sunday School lesson of the Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church for June 7th, 2020. I'm Fred Jeff Smith, pastor of Shiloh, and I'm very happy that you chose to spend this time of Bible study with us. Today's lesson comes from the Book of Proverbs, chapter 1, various verses from chapter 1. We begin a new theme with the month of June, dealing with the value of wisdom. The title of the lesson is Godly Wisdom for Life's Decisions. As we said, the lesson comes from Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, verses 7 and 8, verses 10 and 11, verses 20 through 22, and verses 32 and 33. And I give it to you in that way because it's really a breakdown into how we're going to view the lesson. It's in 5 different sections. Let's talk about the Book of Proverbs from the standpoint of an introduction, give you an overview of the Book of Proverbs. The book is named after its principal contributor, who is Solomon, the son of King David. Its title in Greek and in Hebrew is officially the Proverbs of Solomon. Later, when the book was translated into Latin, Solomon's name was dropped from the official title, and it was simply called the Book of Proverbs. In the rabbinical writings, it is called the Book of Wisdom. The book opens with a statement that attributes it to Solomon, verse 1, which is part of our printed lesson. These are the wise sayings of Solomon, David's son, Israel's king. Solomon's name is also repeated in chapter 10, verse 1, and in chapter 25, verse 1, indicating that those sections were also authored by him. But Solomon is not the sole author of Proverbs. There are also 30 sayings that are attributed to the wise, not knowing who the wise, not identifying who the wise are. But there are 30 sayings of the wise in chapter 22, verse 17 through chapter 24, verse 22. And then there are further sayings of the wise in chapter 24, verses 23 through 34. Agur, the son of Yakeh, is also responsible for Proverbs chapter 30, verses 1 through 33. King Lemuel wrote chapter 31, verses 1 through 9, and the author of the epilogue, chapter 31, verses 10 through 31, is unknown. So while most of the book seems to have been written or is attributed to Solomon, Solomon is not the sole author of all that is contained in Proverbs. But Solomon does appear to be the author of our printed lesson, and the lesson deals with having a proper appreciation for godly wisdom, which leads us to ask the question, what is godly wisdom? When Solomon was offered the opportunity to express his greatest desire, when God appeared to Solomon by night and said, "Tell me what it is that you want as you prepare to lead the people of Israel," Solomon's response to God was, "Give me wisdom. Give me divine wisdom to help me rightly lead your people." So, Solomon's desire was spiritual wisdom, and what it helps us to understand is that there is a worldly wisdom, and then there is a wisdom that goes beyond the things of this world. The person who is truly wise is usually fortified with wisdom of a higher degree than the mere knowledge and experience that we gain from this life. And that to me is an important distinction in understanding the differences between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge is an accumulation of facts, and sometimes those facts can be helped by experience. But wisdom is in knowing how to use the facts and the experience that you have gained in a proper manner in order to gain the desired result. And what that means is you can have knowledge and you can have experience, but if you don't have wisdom, you don't always know how to apply it. So when Solomon asks God for wisdom, he's asking for more than just the ability to recite facts and figures. He's asking for more than just the opportunity to have experience, as beneficial as those things are. He was asking for the ability to know how to synthesize those things in order to bring about the desired result. And for Solomon, the desired result was to rightly lead God's people. There is an unpredictability about the things of this world that makes it dangerous for us to place too much trust in it. We can't put too much stock in knowledge and in facts. One of the things that I've learned in my short life is that facts change. I like to remind people that when I was a kid in school, there were 9 planets in our solar system. And then at some point, it stopped being 9 planets. It started being 8 planets. They said that Pluto was no longer a planet. And then, sometime after that, they revised it and went back and said, well, yeah, Pluto is a planet. So it went from 9 to 8, back to 9. And I'm hearing now, I haven't gone back to research it myself, I'm hearing now that there's perhaps a 10th planet in the solar system. So knowledge changes over time. Facts change over time. At some point, we thought that the world was flat, only to discover that the world was round. So knowledge in and of itself is unpredictable. Things change over time. And that's why you can't put but so much trust in that. The most intelligent of us often find ourselves helpless in dealing with the problems that confront us because we depend more on our own intellect and on our own experience than we do on God. But the truly wise will seek wisdom from a higher power. The truly wise will recognize that beyond their meager human resources, insight, understanding, experience, we must come to a powerful and life-changing conclusion that ultimate wisdom does not come from this world, but comes from God. The most famous passage in Proverbs, it's not a part of today's lesson, but it is the motto, in my opinion, of the whole book. The most famous passage in Proverbs is Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, where it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and don't lean on your own understanding. One translation says, don't lean on what you think you know. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will keep your paths straight. That's what godly wisdom is, and that's what the theme of this quarter's lessons are about, learning how to apply godly wisdom. We have several examples of that in our printed lesson. We're going to take them in the sections in which they are listed. First, Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. These are the wise sayings of Solomon, David's son, Israel's king, written down so we'll know how to live well and right, to understand what life means and where it's going. A manual for living, for learning what's right and just and fair, to teach the inexperienced the ropes and give our young people a grasp of reality. Here the purpose of the book is given, to teach the moral foundation for successful living. The goal of life for us as Christians is to be like God. Well, if we're going to be like God, we must embrace godly characteristics. We must remember and obey godly teachings. And that means that equity and fairness will not leave us. As these teachings are internalized into our hearts, they will affect our actions and the state of purity on which our actions are conducted. It is so very important that we have this as the foundation for our lives. We want to be like God. Lord, I want to be a Christian in my heart. Lord, I want to be more loving in my heart. Lord, I want to be like Jesus in my heart. Well, if we're going to be like Jesus, then we have to embrace Jesus' characteristics. We have to embrace the love of Jesus, which is a love without limit and without restriction. We have to embrace the forgiveness of Jesus, which means that not only do we excuse and pardon the wrong, but we reinstate the one who wronged us to the position that they were in before they wronged us. It's a difficult thing to do, but that's what forgiveness is really all about. If you check out what the Scripture says about it, we have to serve like Jesus. He says, "Think not that the Son of Man came to be served, but to serve," to offer his life as a ransom for many. So if we really want to be like Jesus, then we have to take on his characteristics. And doing that demands that we employ godly wisdom in our endeavors. Second set in our lesson, verses 7 and 8. Start with God. The first step in learning is bowing down to God. Only fools thumb their noses at such wisdom and learning. Pay close attention, friend, to what your father tells you. Never forget what you learned at your mother's knee. This is the contrast between the two ways of life. And by the way, if I haven't said it yet, there are only two ways of life. When I was a child, my mother used to say, life isn't black and white. There are a million shades of gray. Well, I understood what she meant, but in point of fact, there's life and there's death. There's right and there's wrong. If you're a little wrong, you're still wrong. If you're not right, then you are wrong. I said in Bible study the other day, ain't no such thing as being a little pregnant. Either you are or you're not. So there are only two ways of life. In order to be going the right way, you have to make sure that your priorities are in the right place. And the writer of Proverbs, Solomon, tells us where our priorities must have their origin. Start with God. The first step in learning is bowing down to God. That means that God's wisdom has to take preeminence over everybody else's wisdom. It has to take preeminence over mother wit. It has to take preeminence over father wit. It has to take preeminence over what your teacher said, or over what Big Mama said, or over what you heard on the news, or over what the rapper said, or over what the actor said, or over what the politician said. God has to be at the beginning of your wisdom walk. Because if God is not first, then you're starting off on the wrong track. Wisdom begins with acknowledging God. Worldly wisdom pales in the face of godly wisdom. Worldly wisdom is based upon the rational and the reasonable. Worldly wisdom seeks to be pragmatic and realistic. But if current events have not taught us anything else, it surely has taught us that life is not always rational, it is not always reasonable, it is not always pragmatic, and it is not always realistic. When those things have run their course, we need something more. We need something greater. We need something higher, and God's wisdom is still there. The right way starts with living with reverence toward God. Third proverb in our printed lesson, verses 10 and 11. Dear friend, if bad companions tempt you, don't go along with them. If they say, let's go out and raise some hell, let's beat up some old man, mug some old woman, let's pick them clean and get them ready for their funerals. The third proverb in our printed lesson says, don't be so quick to consent to evil ideas. Don't be so quick to seek revenge. I know in these current times, with the things that are going on around us, with the senseless death of the young man in Minneapolis, Minnesota, at the hands of law enforcement, while other law enforcement stood around and watched it happen and did nothing to help, while others pleaded for his life. I know how ugly that is. And I know that our immediate, visceral, human response is to seek revenge. But we should not be so quick to want to consent to evil ideas. Should we protest? Absolutely. I affirm every person who stands up and peacefully protests the wrong that was done in Minneapolis and the many wrongs that have been done over the span of years towards African American people. But to stand up and affirm one's humanity and to press for one's human rights is one thing, but to consent to the idea of revenge and violence and destruction is another. Consent isn't always given with a nod or a verbal affirmation. Consent sometimes is given by simply turning away and pretending that we don't see what's plainly before us. The path of consent leads to spiritual laziness. When we walk this path, we're not as disciplined as we ought to be. We make excuses for our shortcomings. I'm as human as anyone else. We give ourselves permission to be less than God called us to be. We take a good enough attitude about our spiritual lives. But good enough doesn't produce positive things. If we have achieved any success in life, it didn't come from adopting a good enough attitude. So if we didn't take a good enough attitude about those things, then why should we have a good enough attitude about the things of God? We have to be willing to rise above good enough, and we have to be willing to say no to temptations to do evil. The path of consent is a path of ingratitude. Ingratitude towards who? Ingratitude towards God. God gave you gifts in order for you to use them. God gave you talents, and God gave you a mind, and God gave you the ability to think and to strategize. He gave you these things with the intention that you use them. And so it is an act of ingratitude to ignore the gifts that God has given you and to opt only to respond emotionally and angrily, because usually when it's emotional, it's an angry response. That's not what God intended. It's a sign that we have rejected that which God has given us, and it's a poor account of our stewardship of the tools that God has put into our hands. It is a sign of ingratitude to say that I'm not my brother's keeper. To say that I am not responsible for helping others as someone else helped me. Nobody who's viewing me right now did what you've done by themselves. I don't care how much you want to talk about you pulled yourself up by your own bootstraps and nobody helped me. That's a lie. Somebody helped you. Somebody opened a door for you. Somebody made a way of opportunity for you to enjoy what you enjoy. You had to take advantage of it. I'm not trying to devalue the work, the effort that you put in, but don't lie to yourself and don't lie to anyone else and say that I did it all by myself. Somebody helped you. And as somebody helped you, it's your responsibility to help somebody else. This idea that I'm not responsible for what other people do. You may not be accountable for what other people do, but you do have the opportunity to make an impression on those people and to help guide them in the right direction. What do you think a mentor is, if not someone who guides? That's our responsibility. It's not just the parent's responsibility. It's not just the teacher's responsibility. It is the Christian's responsibility. As someone provided guidance for us, it is our responsibility to provide guidance for others. And so to keep people from consenting to evil ideas, we have to point them in a better direction. The fourth proverb that is listed in our lesson, verses 20 through 22. Lady Wisdom goes out in the street and shouts. At the town center, she makes her speech. In the middle of traffic, she takes her stand. At the busiest corner, she calls out, "Simpletons, how long will you wallow in ignorance? Cynics, how long will you feed your cynicism? Idiots, how long will you refuse to learn?" Here, wisdom is personified and pictured standing in the public space, exhorting the ignorant and the cynical to listen and warning of destruction if they do not heed. This is also pictured. This picture of Lady Wisdom standing in the streets making this appeal is also found in Proverbs chapter 8 and in Proverbs chapter 9. Wisdom here in the original Hebrew language is in plural, not singular. And it's intended to signify the intensity and the comprehensiveness of it. The location of the exhortation is in public places, at the town center, in the middle of traffic, at the busiest corner. It's in public places, and that suggests that wisdom is readily available for the common person. There are places where I can't go. I'm not allowed in certain clubs. I'm not allowed in certain neighborhoods. Places are gated. You have to have a card. You have to have a pass in order to get in. But the town square, I can go to. The busiest street corner, I can stand on. The picture that is trying to be made here is that wisdom is not for the exclusive. Wisdom is not for the elite. Wisdom is not reserved for the talented 10, as W.E.B. Du Bois would say. But wisdom is available to everyone. The question is, are you willing to receive the wisdom that God has for you? Since wisdom touches all aspects of life, and since wisdom is available to all who seek it, there's little excuse for those who choose not to embrace it. In other words, you ain't got no reason to not be wise. You ain't got no reason to not seek wisdom. You don't have any reason to not ask the pertinent, relevant question. The beginning of wisdom is knowing that you don't know everything. Knowing that there are things that you still need to learn. I was just talking to someone a few minutes ago about our concerns about people who say, I have a plan for everything. If you got a plan for everything, then what you're suggesting is you don't need any help. You know everything already. Maybe that's your problem. Maybe that's why you didn't win the Democratic nomination. I don't know. You figure out who I'm talking about. The final proverb in our lesson is found in verses 32 and 33. Don't you see what happens, you simpletons, you idiots? Carelessness kills. Complacency is murder. First, pay attention to me, and then relax. Now you can take it easy. You're in good hands. Our lesson closes with a denunciation of the consequences for despising wisdom, and that is retribution. In other words, turning away from God's wisdom leads to ruin. But on the other hand, those who heed wisdom's teachings will live in safety and in security. This is the contrast between the false security of the wicked and the true lasting peace of righteousness. Is it possible for us to receive this wisdom from God today? The answer is clearly yes. If we want it, we can have it. How do you know? Because the Scripture says so. Turn to James chapter 1, verses 5 through 8. I would hope that as you're watching the Sunday school lesson, you have a Bible in front of you. Turn to James chapter 1, verses 5 through 8. And James says, if you don't know what you're doing, pray to the Father. He loves to help. You'll get His help and won't be condescended to when you ask for it. Ask boldly, believingly, without a second thought. People who worry their prayers are like wind-whipped waves. Don't think you're going to get anything from the Master that way. Adrift at sea, keeping all your options open. This tells us that godly wisdom is available to us, but you have to want it, and the indicator that you want it is that you are willing to ask for it. If you want divine wisdom, if you want divine leadership, if you want divine guidance, you can get that from God. And it begins with having a walk with Him opposed to walking with anyone else. It's a good lesson. God bless you.